What is poppin'? It is the Slapton. I am but a lowly Slapton riding these refi waves, and this is This Week in ReFi, where we give you all the refi news that is fit to go ape wild over. Of course, with me is the man with the plan, the man who refuses to give up his summer tan, the Estonian math and madman, Sir Rez.
Hello, it's me. Still
Rez,
Rez.
you're still Rez. Have you ever not been? When was the last time you weren't Rez? How did you come up with the name Rez?
Uh, it's been my screen name in one form or another for years, and when I got into crypto communities, I just ended up using my normal screen name essentially.
AOL.
And
AOL.
at some point, I got went into Solid World and we put that thing together, and I realized like, oh damn, I should probably like dox myself to some degree because that would be nice. And then, as a consequence of that, I realized that I don't want to give up the brand that I've already built, so I just kept on being Rez forever.
When you say screen name, are you talking about AOL screen name?
No, I'm talking about like, what my gamer tags look like and stuff like that.
Did you ever do AOL Instant Messenger?
Mm, no, I think I never experienced AOL Instant Messenger. I think my first experience with chat was maybe MSN.
Classic.
That was very big in Estonia.
Classic. My name Schwerv comes from my AOL Instant Messenger. It was my screen name, so I was trying to see if we both were pulling. Anyway, so your
I
first
see.
experience. Glad to hear that. If you guys want your first experience working in ReFi, boy, do I have a job board for you. Of course, I am talking about ReFiJobs.com. Join it.
Mm,
Curated jobs. You can have maybe it's your first experience, maybe you're already initiated in this space and you're looking for a new opportunity or an additional opportunity. I can't speak highly enough about this. I would go take a look at that link in the description of this video. So Rez, it is a bit of a slow week in terms of refi news.
it
We were
really is.
scouring like animals for you know things to talk about, and we realized, what,
Hmm.
let's just do a special episode, an educational episode, in which we break down one of your favorite topics and one of my favorite topics by proxy,
Mm,
how to build trust as a arbiter of quality in the voluntary carbon space. And you just put out a tweet, and I'm not
hmm.
going to have it up, but I memed back to it. What was the tweet that you recently put up about needing complexity in the
Oh, yeah. The tweet was that the road to bad carbon accounting is paved with well-intentioned simplifications.
That's it. And we did mention this briefly in another episode weeks back, maybe a month and a half back. And one of the things that technology aims to do, or one of the things that technology is used for, is to quote unquote simplify people's lives. Like, humans are always looking for the next simplified thing, right? Like, we don't want to
Hmm.
do 10 steps if we can do one. We
Hmm.
and that's what technology has often given us the ability to do, is to simplify our lives. But there's a problem with that when we start talking about carbon accounting, because it's the complexity, it's the work itself that gives things trust. And I think this is a good time to get into this, because so much of the refi space is now resting on the Verra decision of what they're going to do with tokenized carbon credits. What I haven't seen explained, and hopefully we can help people out with, and we have the time this week, is one,
Hmm.
why do we need Verra in the first place? What do
Hmm.
they do? How do they build trust? And if we were to get around them, what would that look like? What would we need to do? And you are the most qualified person that I talk to on a regular basis to get into this. So I'm going to be picking your brain. And we're going to start with a post
Hmm.
that you wrote a while ago that we did mention, and I've read it, and it's very
Hmm.
good, is this carbon registries and rituals of realness. So can you
Yeah.
give an elevator pitch? It's like a 20-minute read. It's a 21-minute read, depending on how fast you read.
Hmm.
What's going on in this Medium post, and how does it relate to the context of Vera and what we've been talking about?
Hmm. So to just preface this article, I circulated it before I published it, and the main feedback I got was I wasn't expecting to read a book. Uh, so it's a bit long, and I apologize for that. I have learned from that I should really split stuff up into multiple pieces. But when it comes to this specific article, it just tries to give people an introduction on what actually matters when it comes to the carbon markets. Why why do we even have this? What is its role? How do people decide what a good carbon credit is? How do people end up redefining what a carbon credit is just to simplify creating them? What are the outcomes of doing that? And what is a realistic way of building the kind of trust that would make you a good Verra competitor or this kind of, registry style attempt? Because we have already seen, I think, like from my perspective, I'm not gonna name names in like the whole article, but essentially I have seen quite a few attempts in like even Web2 world of making Verra competitors for, let's say, specific kinds of carbon credits, like for instance soil carbon, where the people that are working on this problem at some point realize that, oh no, it's like way too complex to even create a credit. So we're just gonna start snipping away at the boundaries of how we define carbon credits until we find something that's more workable for us. And then, as a consequence of that, quality goes down, and it's not good. And then you can sell it to your friends, but if you want real demand, it's gonna get really complicated.
Okay, so that's what the article on a high level is going, the Medium post is going into, is what happens when people try to spin up a competitor to Verra that is simpler, maybe more cost efficient, is easier to do. The end result typically is you can sell it to your friends. It's kind of like when you run a business and the only customer you get is your mom, right? Your supportive mom, right?
Yeah, let's say you're an entrepreneur, you have other entrepreneur friends, they'd like to be carbon neutral, so you sell them this idea of being carbon neutral, they buy it, and then you talk with, like, I don't know, a carbon trading house, and they look at whatever you're doing and they go like, ha, I see.
Right.
Another one of those.
So this is, the fundamental question I think that I've been thinking about as we have been approaching this consultation period with Verra, and they're ultimately going to divine their decision that's going to have an outsized effect on this entire refi space. The fundamental question is, why do we need Verra? First question is currently, do we need Verra? What is your opinion on that? We do. All right. So I have you shared this, a graphic, and maybe this can elucidate why, quote unquote, we need Verra. This is the volume of tokenized carbon that has been.
Oh, yeah, just not even tokenized. This is just like carbon credits in the voluntary carbon market.
Good.
Who's moving them?
Yes, who's moving them? So not even tokenized, just in general. And we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, I believe, 6 standards, and Verra's at the bottom, Verified Carbon Standard, VCS. And if we look in 2021, 125.6, what was the unit of measure on that?
Megatons.
Megatons of carbon. The next closest is Clean Development Mechanism. And I'm not throwing shade at them. I'm not throwing shade at any of these other people. But to those listening, have you guys ever heard of Clean Development Mechanism? Right?
Well, I have.
Well,
they're
have.
the original. Yes. They're the original carbon registry. They were like the first big one.
Right.
A long time
ago. And maybe
people
listening to this know because they're the people that know. But like, if you're a peripheral person in this space, do you even know of Clean Development Mechanism, right? Which just goes to show you how dominant Verra is in this space. So I would, and you said it, and this is the proof. I would argue at current, we need them because they are top banana.
Yep.
Right?
The top banana.
They are the top banana. So then the next question is, why do we need them? Why can't, what are they doing? Why can't these other people produce these carbon credits? What is the problem in producing these in verifying carbon?
Yes. So this is where we get into where the carbon market is very messy. So how do I put this? I could like maybe get some sort of a piece of paper or something and then just write 1 ton of carbon on it and maybe have you buy it, and then you could maybe I don't know, rip it up and say that you used this carbon credit. And when somebody asks you, you tell them that, hey, I'm carbon neutral for like a few months because Rez sold me some nice Rez credits from the Rez registry.
You heard it
And
here,
then
folks. Res credits coming in the next 4 months. Type a comment. Type whitelist to get whitelisted.
Oh no. But yeah, the problem there is like, you would have to trust me that I actually did something in the background, and there aren't a lot of good reasons to trust me because fundamentally I have all of the incentives to misrepresent reality as much as possible, so I could get bigger numbers. And if I get bigger numbers, I can sell more units. And if I sell more units, I can potentially make more money, assuming I can find buyers. So, generally speaking, a normal buyer doesn't trust Mr. Rez when he shows up with like 1 ton of carbon written on the back of a receipt. It's not really a real thing. So functionally, there's no demand for it. And the next question is, but how do you create demand? How do you create this like level of trust that your buyer can have some sort of confidence that this carbon credit is actually meaningful? It'll do something, and it won't come back to haunt them later on when they've advertised for years that they are carbon neutral because of Rez credits, right? That's not like that's not a good vibe.
So
It's a bad.
so there you go. So anybody can spin up a carbon credit, res credit coming soon.
Yeah.
The question is, what processes are put in place to instill trust in the buyer?
Yeah.
Let's get into that. What processes must be put in place or currently put in place, let's say by Verra, that fundamentally instill trust in the buyer?
Well, the first thing is this thing called a methodology, which is a document which just outlines how you're supposed to do all of this carbon accounting, how you're supposed to run a project of a specific kind, what are you supposed to document, what are these accompanying things, and then you're supposed to follow that. So this is part one. Part two is that you have this organization that it isn't Verra or isn't like a carbon registry that then goes in and confirms that this paperwork has been properly followed. It looks legit, and they vouch for it. So they don't have skin in the game in terms of the outcome. They just, they provide this service of saying, I agree that this person followed this methodology, their math makes sense. I went on the ground, it looked right, I followed the process as it was outlined in the methodology, and then they finally send this to the registry, who then says, okay, we accept this, and then they put it on the registry. So there's this separation of concerns, and then there is this neutral document that just outlines what a specific kind of carbon credit looks like for that registry.
This is kind of interesting because I'm like massively interested in governance, and I have copies of countries' constitutions. I think it's really fascinating stuff. And what you're seeing is a separation of power. You have a legislative body, a law creating body, and you have an executive body. That's what you've described in a very high level overview. You have we're going to write the laws. These are what we're going to follow, but it's a completely separate entity that is making sure that those laws are followed. And that separation of power creates trust. So Verra will say, here's the methodology. If you're doing mangroves, which you and Solid World are very interested in, right? This is how you account for mangroves, and it has to be rigorous and it has to make sense and people have to believe in it. But Verra themselves, and this is the part that took me a minute to understand, are not going out and verifying that that is happening, right? They are empowering people to go out and make sure so there's not a conflict of interest. Okay, so
yes, and these people are accountable to Verra. Like, Verra could essentially at some point just decide like, no, this validation verification body, or VVB as we're called, like, they've been doing bad work. We don't like it. Like, we're gonna issue them a warning, maybe, or just say that nope, we're done with you. Next, Just like, and you're accountable to being following the procedure, actually.
And so that sounds like the judicial branch of the process, right? Where you get to judge
Yeah.
if somebody is not doing what they're doing. Very
Yes,
interesting.
and then there are these public rounds of comment of going like, okay, and there are all of these public documents that say we're doing this and this and this, and VVB agrees that this and this and this are pretty cool, but publicly we're welcoming even more comments to criticize specific ways how these things have been interpreted. So that's almost like a jury, you could say, or some sort of this sort of mechanism of gathering more feedback that isn't directly tied with Verra having to do all of legislative branches duties.
Yeah, and you could even make an argument that the market itself, to some degree, is the jury of if this is happening, right? Because if the market doesn't believe in it, then they don't buy it, and that's going to be incentive to change it. Okay, so if we get into methodologies, because this is something that's been kicking around a lot in ReFi, particularly with DMRV circles, they're very interested in methodologies. What is the challenges of creating a methodology? And again, this is kind of the thing is like, what makes a good methodology that people will trust? And is it challenging? Is there what's the level of rigor involved in setting it and following it?
Putting together methodologies is also something that Verra shouldn't be doing on their own, and they don't. This is also essentially delegated to people that want to write methodologies, and that is also open to comment from people that want to criticize methodologies. So there's a lot of including stakeholders into every branch of the process of deciding what is real. You engage with the scientific community. They look at, is this rigorous enough? Does this meet statistical standards? Is the way that this modeling is proposed, does that make sense? Then on project proponent sides, there's also this question of feasibility. Maybe the requirements are so demanding, actually, that it's impossible to follow the methodology. That can definitely happen. For instance, if you require an insane amount of measurement, and then the measurement is so expensive that actually what you're measuring is less valuable than the whole measurement process itself. This can happen.
Like if you were growing like a hectares of trees, right? And the methodology said that you need to sample every tree, and make sure
measure every tree in the forest,
every
for example.
diameter, every length. It's like that methodology is very rigorous, but so costly so you need to find a balance of rigor versus cost, and that is a challenge in and of itself. Good. What are the other challenges of methodologies?
The rest of them are nuts, and this is where things get a bit complicated. So, as we mentioned last week, for instance, observing the biomass of trees, this is somewhat of a solvable problem because you can see what is happening on the ground in reality right now. Like, that's something you can go and, have boots on the ground. You can see it from satellites. You could fly drones over it. There are ways of figuring out what is the biomass of trees, for example. But you have these very important pillars of a quality carbon credit, which go in addition to that. And this is the thing that generally is very complicated. These three things are additionality, it's permanence, and it's leakage. Very important concepts when it comes to carbon credits. If you do any of these three things badly, you're not creating a carbon credit. You are potentially creating very greenwashy assets that just look like carbon credits. So let's go deeper into that.
Let's start with what did you start with? Permanence? Or no, you started with additionality.
Additionality.
We usually start with additionality. Okay, go with additionality. Yeah. How would you explain additionality to somebody who had no concept of what it was?
Additionality has many factors, but what it generally comes down to is if this carbon project didn't exist, if we didn't put these additional incentives on the table for you, would the behavior that we're observing still happen? This is part of it. And the second part of it is what would happen if these incentives weren't on the table? This is called the baseline. So, there is a change from a baseline, and whatever is additional to that baseline is what we can claim as carbon credits. So if you're growing a forest anyway, and let's say it's a environmentally protected area that even the state would have very huge difficulties chopping down, Additionality is nothing for a carbon project because fundamentally it's already protected, right? There is no scenario under which we could issue you carbon credits for having the trees, because the trees have always been there and they will continue being there. You might have, for instance, new practices that you're doing in the forest. You might be, I don't know, adding fertilizer or like doing some soil fixes or I don't know, like this gets into a really weird territory. But essentially, you can do other things for money on top of that to manage this forest that could be additional. But the trees sequestering the carbon on their own are not additional in an environmentally protected area, for example.
Well said. So to me, the additionality part is the most mystical, esoteric part of the entire methodology. So I don't know the answer to this. I'm asking you sincerely, and I don't mean to put you on the spot. How do you even go? I'm going to give you a specific example. I have 10 hectares of land in a country, Guyana. I'm going to go to Verra and I'm going to say, hey, this forest is being threatened by development. Therefore, by preserving this, I could sell it to the developers and make money. But if you guys give me some credit here, I will keep it and preserve it. How can that even be established that that scenario is true, that what I am telling you is true, that it is in fact being threatened, and that there are developers knocking on my door to buy it? How do I prove that?
Part of it is, for instance, regional baselining. So you could say that, hey, in this like larger area that I'm in, there's a lot of deforestation happening. And then you could possibly claim that since there's this demand for logging, and I'm not allowing this area to be logged, potentially, and I'm going to guarantee that this area won't be logged, you could claim something based on the scenario that it might be chopped down, for instance. And this is where it gets really mystical, because we have had some very crazy baselines being created, which essentially just say like, yeah, this area had 100% chance of being chopped down. So all of the sequestration that the trees do in this area, it's mine now. Thank you. Okay, cheers. I'm leaving now.
Because you're making a probabilistic determination, right? You're saying that there's a probability of this amount happening. And as you know, that is very hard to, with complete certainty, nail down. Impossible.
It's very, it's actually super difficult.
Right.
This is a very important part, but it's also a very difficult part. And we'll get into, what potential simplifications in this area might be later on. But fundamentally, you have to prove that whatever behavior you're doing now, you wouldn't have been doing this if this carbon project didn't exist. So you have to kind of prove a negative in a real sense. And then you have to, based on that, figure out what part or percentage or math equation is fair to use in this sort of situation, which would justify you getting compensated for it, but wouldn't be well, everything is liable to being chopped down, so I should be compensated for having a forest, because that potentially somebody would be paying you and there would be no outcome actually. Right. Paying forest owners is not a viable way to stop climate change inherently, because you want to direct funds in the areas where they can do the most good, right? You want to be exact and detailed with this kind of approach, because that is how you create good carbon credits that mean something, that make a change, and have additionality. It changed. It made a change somewhere. So
my frame of reference in I do real estate investing. I put an offer on a property last night. One of the things that I do to come up with a potential value after I'm done fixing it, is what are called comparable sales. Maybe, would that be the case if I pointed to 10 hectares of land to my left and said that person just got, they just got bought out by a developer? Like, that would be an example of proving the probability of, or maybe even coming to Verra with an offer from a developer saying, I'm getting an offer for this amount, for this hectarage, for this amount. Like that would be very good. But then there's a problem with that.
Yeah.
How do we know that
Yeah,
there isn't? Yeah.
you're hitting the nail on the head. Forest conservation is a very complicated topic in general, because you have to prove that this forest would otherwise not be here. That's a very hard thing to do. This is, for instance, why reforestation can be a bit easier to do, because you know, you can have this that, hey, there hasn't been a forest here for 10 years, or this mangrove has been degraded for, decades at this point. So I am going to invest into this land. I'm going to make sure that these mangroves regenerate this land, and I'm not going to chop them down. This has better additionality because fundamentally you are actively doing something instead of avoiding a negative action.
Good. So already we're in the very first element, and
Yes.
the complexities and the what
Yes.
ifs and the contingencies are endless. We could go on forever. So if you're thinking about spinning up your own competitor to Verra, you need to figure out how you're going to prove additionality, and maybe, and so you said, like, you've seen simplifications. Can you give me an example of how people have tried and maybe, and I don't mean to put this in a negative light, but maybe have failed in simplifying the process of proving additionality?
Well, one of these things that you could do if you want it to be very spicy is say something like additionality is bullshit and all positive behavior should be rewarded, which is a hot take that I can't disagree more with, possibly.
Like it. I'm going to accept that just to tick you off. I'm going to write additionality is bullshit on my Twitter after this.
Yeah. And you're going to get a bunch of likes from people that don't understand carbon accounting. And, when somebody calls you out on it, you can say that, hey, it's really unfair because all of these nice people are already doing all of these nice things and they deserve to be compensated.
I'm just going to tell them to talk to you. I'm going to say Rez.
Rez is an expert on why additionality is bullshit. Yeah.
He told me. I just like when people, like, with Centaurian aplomb just say like a grand statement like, this is bullshit. You know what I mean? With no nuance. You know what I mean? Like
no nuance. Yeah. It's just like, give up. Yeah.
It's my favorite, dude.
But yeah. So, like, a very good example might be, let's say you have a farmer, right? And in farming, in soil carbon projects, you might have these things called cover crops, which are just these additional crops that you grow in the middle of your main crop to keep the soil covered. And some farmers already do this because they feel it's a good practice, it's good for their soil, it makes sense in that context. And then you end up with this very sticky question of, I could go up to another farmer that doesn't do this and pay them to start doing it. Or I could go to this farmer who's been doing this for 10 years, and it feels very fair to also, give them something for it. This occasionally happens. It's called grandfathering. It's a bit of a weird practice in my opinion, but it does happen. It's essentially going like, this person was a pioneer, they also deserve to be compensated, but we'll, consider this additional for reasons. It can be very problematic. But the point is that if you pay somebody to start putting cover crops on and they do it, this is, clearly additional because in the past you can see that they didn't do this. But if you have a farmer that has been growing cover crops for 10 years, it's a much harder proposition to sell off this concept that, hey, because this carbon project exists, they're doing this, when there's clearly evidence in the past saying that that is not the case. So this is an area where it gets very complicated of what is fair is in competition with what is a carbon credit. You see what I mean?
I do, and I would make the argument Rez, that if I were a farmer doing the quote unquote right thing for the last decade, and I'm gonna,
you would feel offended by
I would be upset. 100%. I mean, that's human. Like, I did the right thing, my neighbor didn't, and you're gonna incentivize him. Like, what's my reward? And so there's always that element of human. We could say your reward is that you were doing the right thing and you were virtuous. It's like, pay me, right? That's how people think. Pay me. So I completely agree. And I would even make the argument that if you're going to pay a farmer who wasn't doing the right thing to do the right thing, how do you not pay his neighbor who was doing it on his own volition, right? So there you go.
Very sticky question. Yeah,
Very sticky question.
I agree. And that's also why I feel carbon credits aren't a perfect answer always to like any sort of emissions situation you might have. It might make sense in some situations to just have like government level regulation that says, no, you just all need to do the right thing, and if you all need to do the right thing, but I will subsidize it, or, for instance, or some like relatively equitable deal that looks something like this. You still have the same outcomes, but it doesn't feel unfair, and it also doesn't have these accounting issues because they're not carbon credits, right?
So
Carbon credits are supposed to create a change. If they're not creating a change, it's very hard to call it a carbon credit.
So to your original point, if a competitor to Verra, or we want to spin something up Rez Coin, and it was Rez Coin's opinion that additionality was bullshit. The problem with that is then you could be somebody who owns 10 hectares of land that are absolutely protected. They're remote. No one's ever going to develop them, and Rez Coin has to give them money because additionality is no longer. And so now you could have a system in which capital is being absolutely misappropriated, and it is no longer representing any sort of environmental positivity, right? And so then that's going to cut into the trust of that Rez Coin, a Rez Coin that basically we give it to anybody. We give it to anybody who owns a forest. Because how do we know if they're going to do what that if we didn't, they were going to do the wrong thing or the bad thing for the environment?
Yeah, exactly.
Right? Yeah, you're right. To your point, that is a simple thing to do, but I think we would all agree that that is not a trusting. That would not instill trust in the buyer of that credit.
Yeah,
right?
exactly. Because fundamentally, what I think a lot of people think is, wow, that was a sentence. What I think is a lot of people think.
English is hard. Yeah.
There seems to be this understanding that almost as if you create carbon credits, there will always be demand. Fundamentally, carbon credits are a buyer's market. There are discerning buyers that don't want the bad optics. They don't want the uncertain outcomes, and they will just either pay a premium or just not buy at all if they don't have this expectation that it's actually going to do something. So it gets into like a very problematic territory over there.
When you invest in TradFi, there's sectors of them, energy, healthcare. There's something called consumer discretionary, right? And that's stuff that people choose to spend their money on, but do not have to. Energy is not one of those things. Healthcare is not one of those things. Those tend to be recession proof more than consumer discretionary. I could make the argument, maybe you would as well, that carbon credits would probably fall under the consumer discretionary because technically you don't need them if you're a company. Obviously, they become less discretionary the more the population demands them of the corporation that buys them, right? So
ESG, yes.
Exactly. So really, we, the consumer, the population, are the ones who can turn we can turn carbon credits from consumer discretionary to essentially essential. Or essentially, we both did a fun English phrase. So
nice.
That's a very interesting way to put it. Yeah, I'm learning things, Rez. This is fantastic.
Yay.
All right, so we got through some of the challenges of additionalities, and maybe if somebody were trying to simplify it, the issues that they would run into next is leakage. So let's talk about leakage, and this isn't talked about nearly as much as additionality. So what is that?
Ooh, yeah. Leakage is so when we talked about additionality and we, got to this conclusion that it's very hard to do. When we're talking about leakage, it's even worse. Because leakage is this interesting concept that if this carbon project exists in this specific area, are there negative side effects of this, which will just move the emissions somewhere else, right? So if I paid you to not drive your car, but your friend is now driving your car everywhere along with you, we did essentially the accounting maneuver of putting your emissions on someone else's books. We didn't actually cause a change again. It was additional in the sense that something happened, but it wasn't, it wasn't emission reductions because we just moved the emission somewhere else.
So
this can happen.
In my original example, I have 10 hectares. Now, we have passed the test of additionality. I have proved reasonably that if you do not give me money to preserve this, that I will sell out. However, there's 10 hectares owned by my neighbor, and he will absolutely sell out to the development. Would that speak to leakage?
Potentially. Leakage is generally understood in like forestry terms, for example. of being did the regions deforestation rates actually go down, for example? This might be a way we could argue that there was less leakage. But this is a very hard thing to document in the first place. There is no right answer on how you're supposed to document leakage that will yield a good result. But generally, this requires both the project proponent and the validation verification body to think very hard and long about what is happening in the surrounding area and how do the new behaviors we introduced affect surrounding conditions. And, did these effects essentially reverse everything at the end? This is something that even in Verra terms, I don't think anybody's very good at this, but it is a very important thing to keep in mind because there can be examples where you could argue just on the basis of leakage that it's not a valid carbon credit. So if we, for instance...
I would say, to me, this is maybe the hardest because the amount of variables, the amount of inputs are infinite. Mm-hmm. Right? So like in your example of I can't drive my car, there are infinite ways I can work around not driving my car. It could be my friend, it could be taking a bus, it could be something more polluting, right? Like taking a plane, maybe, you know what I mean? Or a less
private jet,
private jet, or a bicycle, which is less polluting, or maybe I have to move my work where I'm commuting to closer to me, and then that's deforestation that happens to build the building next to me, right? Like, if you actually think about the complexities of the systems, like, it's infinite.
Yeah. There's an infinitely complex system that you're working in, and there's somewhat of an expectation of best faith when it comes to this area. Also, it's very hard to argue that your move in a butterfly flapped its wings and in Brazil a 200,000 square kilometer area got deforested.
Chaos theory. You ever see Jurassic
that's
Park?
leakage.
You ever see Jurassic Park where Jeff Goldblum puts a drop of water on his hand and he's like, it never goes the same way twice, except he says it like Jeff Goldblum. He's explaining chaos theory. I don't know, this is a tangent. All right, so that's again, very difficult to figure out. Have you seen attempts at simplification that have you scratching your head? Simplification of leakage.
Well, it's mostly like we're just not going to consider it at all, which can be very problematic. Or we can have something like a very good example.
Do it.
So, let's say you're increasing your soil carbon, right? But you're increasing your soil carbon maybe by buying manure from your neighbor who has cows. And now the question is, does your neighbor who has cows, who you're buying this from, was that guy just applying the same manure to his fields, right? Because you just took away his manure because you paid a better price for it. So fundamentally, the same product.
Nitrogen, right? He buys nitrogen at the market.
Sure. Yeah, you essentially swapped behaviors with your neighbor. It didn't functionally do that much. So there are situations like this where, these soil amendments, for example, can cause leakage because you're interacting with this complex local system, and you're just, moving resources which were applied elsewhere into yours, or moving your behavior out to somebody else. And there are clear situations where you can document, I am doing X behavior, and then it turns out that if the validation verification body thinks a bit about it, they realize that, that doesn't sound like carbon credit, sorry. No.
Two down.
But simplifications would be not thinking about it at all. It might be writing your methodology that we're very happy with people putting manure on their fields in our projects, and then just not considering, where is the manure coming from, for example. It might be we have this very emission-intense behavior that we have to do as a consequence of running the project, but that's never documented. For example, of how do you get this heavy machinery here? What are the emissions being caused by reforesting an area, because it does have emissions costs. So we have to factor a bunch of these things in, and a lot of these are very reasonable and logical, and you can figure them out. But as you get to the margins, it also becomes very hard to figure out, like, did somebody else's behavior actually change and reverse your behavior? There are these interesting people on the internet that every time they hear somebody say that they're vegan, they say, "Oh, haha, I'm eating twice as much meat today, just because of you." And it's like,
Those people.
It's like great reversals. I love it. What the hell?
But it's a good point, right? Like, again,
Yeah.
infinite. Who would think that there is a person that would pollute doubly to spite the person?
It's just to spite you. But
they
sometimes
exist.
it is.
Yeah.
And it can happen in like forestry terms. Like this could potentially happen. Improved forest management is a sort of methodology where you might actually have these logging companies, but you are paying them to be more sustainable in their own logging practices. Like that's essentially what you're paying for, because otherwise they would, have an increased rate of deforestation, and at some point they'd run out of forest. And we're doing this because they don't have enough money. So in that kind of a situation, like, you can measurably see that leakage. There shouldn't be any leakage because you have a documented area where they're operating, and you can see that the deforestation rate's going down. But if you have a logging company that essentially says, "Hey, I'm not chopping down this area, I'm chopping down the one next to it, but pay me for this area," it doesn't make sense anymore. So there's a sort of complexity and almost detective work that you'd have to do to figure out if does this make sense.
And there's even a problem with defining local areas, because that's very subjective. Because if I don't chop down trees in Estonia, but I'm chopping down trees in America, are we, by consequence of that, just a completely different, like, can you tie those two events together? Maybe you can't. But would that not be leakage? I think it would be, right? Like, I didn't deforest your country, I deforested mine.
Yeah. Actually, in Estonia, we have this very cool situation where as I've understood the situation, Denmark considers burning wood to be a renewable source of energy, and therefore it's very, nice and low emissions. But a lot of that comes from Estonia, where we're chopping down our forests because, they are doing low emission stuff. And if that, behavior on their end didn't exist, then on our end, we'd have more forests because, the demand for forests would also be just lower. It's a complicated system, but you have to appreciate that, the moment you start simplifying this down even more, then you get into like a bad situation, because there will be very obvious things. There will be very hard, like easy to notice and obvious things that you're just closing your eyes to, because you don't want to, you don't want to make your system too complex, and that also gets very hard.
Good.
So that's part of it.
And you cut out trust because you've oversimplified. So that's 2 down. We got 1 more to go. This might be my favorite, and permanence. And so I remember the question when it was first posed, when I was a neophyte to ReFi and all of this in carbon markets. I was modding in Klima, and someone had asked, like, okay, so somebody plants a bunch of trees, they get a bunch of credits. Why can't they just burn the forest down? And Rez, I was like sitting there being like, I was like, huh, I didn't know what to write. I was like, I think it was like a back channel. I was like, why can't they just burn the forest down? And I mean, technically you could do it. I mean, you're never going to get carbon credits issued to you again, right?
Yeah,
but
it's
you could do it. There's in Looney Tunes. There's a Bugs Bunny. He has I think it was Daffy Duck, one of them. He has like poison, and he goes, "You can drink anything once." That's like one of my favorite. It's like actually like a really like
you can drink anything.
You can drink anything. You can do anything once. It's the question of repeatability and sustainability. I can do that. I can plant trees, burn them down, but then what?
Yeah.
So
yeah. So this is one of my favorites as well, because let's say for this forestry example, if we removed permanence from the equation, we could do this very fun thing of just paying all forest owners, even if they have the intention of chopping down the forest for, just the trees growing again. Like that could be something here, because let's say this was a deforested area, and the argument is essentially, hey, we're going to put up this forest, but I'm going to chop it down in 30 years. But I wouldn't put up this forest, but I am going to chop it down in 30 years, right? That could be like a methodology of logging company subsidies, essentially.
And again,
So how we
we're predicting the unknowable, right? Like
Yeah,
there's
it's very hard.
you
Yeah, you
can't.
you can't monitor the future using like drones. Sadly, we haven't invented that tech yet.
It's always like I remember this example. It's like you say like, can we make a prediction, a scientific prediction that the sun will rise in the east tomorrow? It's
Mm-hmm.
highly probable, but there's no way of knowing. There's zero way of 100% knowing it.
Definitively
It's
knowing
an unknowable
yeah.
thing, right? And so
Mm-hmm.
that is the case with all of permanence. So again, how do like what would be the oversimplification of permanence? I guess you could say you could ignore it, right? You basically give the
Yeah,
credits, and whatever happens after that, who cares? And obviously that would
yeah. Who
create
cares?
all sorts of problems.
Yeah, but there is an interesting simplification here that I have seen that kind of almost makes sense.
Okay.
This is something called ton-year accounting, where you're essentially saying that we're going to reward this behavior right now, and we're gonna keep doing that. And if you haven't been sequestering anymore, or you chop the forest down or something, there is a value to keeping emissions out of the air, because emissions right now are worse than emissions 30 years in the future, for example, because of these like what you would call like feedback loops of there are more emissions in the air, the ice caps melt, more methane gets released, that increases the whole cycle again, and that's also very bad. So there are ways of going around that, doing ton-year accounting, and then essentially saying 100 ton years, for example, equals 1 ton of a carbon offset, for example. You could do that. Like, it's possible. It has issues because it requires you to close your eyes to a bunch of different factors. You'd need to figure out what the value of a ton of carbon avoided today versus tomorrow might look like. These are napkin math numbers fundamentally, and there's no really correct way to do it. But you could do it, like, definitely. But if you are running a carbon project, for example, where you didn't require the forest owner to sign anything in terms of what their future intentions are, then you would have a very significant problem in terms of permanence. Because yes, I can know that the trees are there today, but I can't know how long they're going to be there. And fundamentally, a carbon credits should represent, something being removed, and preferably forever, but at least for 30, 50, 100 years. Definitely not chopping it down tomorrow, right?
There you go. There you have. Well, hey, so we've kind of gone through the consequence of abstracting the complexity, of simplifying.
Mm-hmm.
And I think hopefully what we've left is this idea that it is the rigor, it is the complexity that builds in trust.
Yes.
And you can have one or the, and it's a balancing act, right? Because too much rigor becomes so cost prohibitive and just unwieldy that you can't do it.
Yeah. That's part of what Verra suffers from, is that if we're running a forestry project, just doing all of the paperwork and research and confirmation costs so much that running a small enough project, you still have to do paperwork, and it costs money and it costs time. So there comes a moment where your project is just so small that all of this paperwork gets unwieldy and hard to manage.
And you hear that all the time, where you say like Verra doesn't really support. It's not that they don't support; it's that the system that we're in doesn't support for like a certain carbon project under a certain tonnage to even apply. Like economically, it doesn't make sense. Exactly what you said. And that is an issue.
If we start valuing carbon higher, it can become economically viable. I mean, the goalpost can like shift like that. But in any given moment of time, there will be a small enough project that it becomes unprofitable.
Right. So if I want to plant 10 trees in my backyard, it's probably not economically viable for me to say to Verra, hey, let's go put this in, and it's going to cost me more money to go through the process than I'd ever receive, right? Mm-hmm. So here's the final question, and I think this is literally the $1 million question, and it's probably more than $1 million question.
Mm-hmm. It is. It's $1 billion question.
It is. And one of the reasons that I think that me questioning you and you explain this is so important because maybe some people that are smarter than I am, certainly, maybe I'll speak for myself, and more determined and more, wide-eyed and bushy-tailed, we'll figure this out. How does an entity, let's say in Web3, spin up? Where would you even start? Is it worth it? Is it viable to work around Verra entirely in a case in which we would need to do that? Hopefully we don't. How does it even happen?
Well, first off, I'd like to say that I think it's important and people should attempt it, even if Verra is very cooperative, because fundamentally having one extremely centralized entity is not preferable when it just comes to the competitiveness and innovation when it comes to, the market. We need multiple players trying out different experiments, being accountable to each other, because if they start doing weird stuff, they will start losing market share. I think that's a very reasonable way to think about it.
You're such a capitalist, Rez. You're such a capitalist.
Yeah, such a capitalist.
A free market champion.
Ooh, so free market. You have no idea.
Sorry.
But, money and incentives are very exciting. But the thing is, we talked a lot about quality, and ultimately now we get into a very hard situation, because let's say you're doing all of the things right. Let's say you're even doing it better than everybody else. You're still going to go up to a corporation. You're going to ask their carbon procurement manager of, hey, I have 1,000 tons of this cool new registry's carbon credits. Would you like to buy them? Their response to you will be, I have this nice sheet of paper for procurement purposes. I have 3 checkbox, so could you tell me, which checkbox it is? Are you CDM? Are you gold standard? Or are you Verra? I need to know. There's a box. I need to check the box. Then we can talk about it. But I need to check the box, right?
And that's it. You can't fault that. That is their job. They are told by the people above them, do not participate in anything that is not these 3 things.
Yes. Because it's an optics risk. Yeah, it's an optics risk. There's no proven track record yet. You don't have let's say other high profile buyers. You can't point to 10 corporations that have bought from you before. And now when this procurement person has to go to their boss and their boss's boss and their boss's boss's boss to say that, hey, we have this very cool new registry and I think they're, on par or maybe even better. And I think we should buy from them. They are putting themselves on the line when it comes to reputational damage they might be taking in that company. And it feels emotionally really hard to do. If you're that person tasked with procurement, you might not have the leeway to make those decisions yourself. And even if you do, you are exposed a lot internally of being that one stupid person that got caught out by a carbon registry that maybe wasn't doing the right thing at the end.
The risks
maybe
of
they
that
had
far outweigh. You're not going to be championed in the corporate space for coming up. We're recognizing or gaining traction for the new Rez Coin. No one's going to herald you, but if you screw up, you will be, what's the word, pilloried for your, for your naivete and all that. So the incentive structure is not there. And the cynic in me also says that these corporations view this as something that they have to do, not necessarily Coca-Cola is interested in making money. Their focus, that's where they're going to put their attention. Why would they put their attention into looking into alternatives to the already established voluntary carbon verification, entities? That's not.
And they don't. Optics risk is a huge challenge actually, because fundamentally, let's say you're a corporation that people don't have good feelings about. Let's say, I don't know, you're a tobacco company, but you do carbon offsetting, right? You're very exposed to just people are always going to be on the lookout for the next bad thing you do. You know that there will be somebody who is going to punish you for this if you mess up. And these are actually end up being the organizations that put the most emphasis on quality, because it's just so destructive if they don't. But the question ends up being, how do you approach this market? The answer to that, I don't think viably, is simplifying things away. because you are competing on a market with things that have better quality. And functionally, anytime a simplification just makes something cheaper at the expense of potentially causing optics damage down the line, you end up being in this situation where, yes, you aren't paying with money, you're paying with your reputation. That's more expensive. That's like not a good deal. So you have to have this emphasis on quality, and you have to, develop a track record, and you have to get a lot of buy-in that might not be corporations. You have to go to these international consortiums, maybe, that deal in the legitimizing of carbon registries. For instance, IETA or ICROA, these two powerhouses that together they're very like connected organizations, but they essentially just function as a source of trust for potentially a new registry. So that might be an avenue where you get recognized.
You just made me
Different
think of
one.
something, Rez. A connection that I just made, I think, is like actually germane to the space that we're in. Is think of Ethereum and how its throughput has been low, and you have these alternatives that abstract away the rigor of decentralization, right?
Oh yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So at the same time, why, if you're an institution moving hundreds of millions of dollars, what are they all going to use? They're all going to use the Ethereum blockchain. One, it's battle tested, it's trusted. They wouldn't look like a fool if it went down. Like you could say to your constituents, hey, if we were going to
Everybody does this.
if we were going to trust a blockchain, why wouldn't we trust the longest one that has the most, the battle tested record? So it's like the same thing. So, and this has always been my argument when people want to say, well, that throughput's like, and I'm a big Polygon supporter, but it's like Polygon has abstracted away the decentralization of Ethereum. That's why it's cheaper, simpler, more convenient, but it will not be trusted in the eyes of institutions. That's what Ethereum
could be.
You're right. It could be. I shouldn't say that. It will take time. The head start that Ethereum has and the battles that it has gone through mean a lot. That reputation means a lot when you have high stakes. So that's just kind of a connection that I think to shill Ethereum.
Yeah. Yay. But yeah, I fully agree. It's this thing called, I think it was the Lindy effect of the longer you've been around, the more valuable it is. The less changes there are, the more trustworthy it is. Because if, people can't find problems in 2 years, maybe the likelihood that they find a problem in the next 2 years is pretty low, actually. If you've been around for 6 months, the probability that there will be issues in 2 years is much higher. So it's a hard place to be in, and you have these things called buying guidelines working against you. So, for instance, airlines have a very well defined set of criteria that they are allowed to buy carbon credits from. There is a list of methodologies and registries associated with those that airlines are able to purchase. There are even more specific conditions. For instance, it can't be older than vintage 2016, that even add more specificity to it. And getting added on that list as another registry is a huge win, but it's a very unclear path when it comes to getting there. So there are so many moving pieces. It's a big ask.
It's a big ask. What I'm thinking is you're going to need deep pockets, strong connections to things like IETA, maybe even some backdoors into major corporations or whatever, or even minor corporations.
Intergovernmental organizations, Paris Agreement people that deal in emissions discussions all the time. There's a lot of building relationships in the background with the gatekeepers of these, what is considered a good registry that you have to do in order to get accepted. And this is why I keep emphasizing that the answer in the short term is very unlikely in the short term, that anything that pops up in the next year is immediately going to have anywhere near the sort of demand that Verra currently has.
That's I think that's more than a fair statement. I think that's...
This is the power that Verra has, is essentially the Lindy effect of knowing that even though they do get criticized, everybody else is on board. There are so many corporations buying. It's in the buying guidelines. So ultimately, any corporation that buys and potentially gets some sort of optics damage due to, for instance, what Verra might do, or what a VVB might do, or what the methodology might look like, it's a lot less culpable. It's a lot less damaging than going out trying something new, taking a risk, and then getting blamed for it.
Well, there are the challenges. I think that they're manifold and significant. Now, here's the opportunity. Because this is so challenging, if you can crack this, not only will you be a hero in this space and have done good for the world, you will be making money. Fortune, yeah. Right? So
a fortune. It's a great thing to do. Fundamentally, competition needs to exist. It needs to deepen. We need to have alternatives that can take away market share because it keeps everybody on their toes. If there's an alternative that's, we are more reputable and these damaging things don't apply to us, everybody will be more cautious when it comes to avoiding those damaging things and being better at carbon accounting and enforcing the standards also on the VVBs of punishing them actually when they do bad things. All of these factors need to be deepened and they need to get better because fundamentally, I don't think it's a good situation if somebody has 90% of the market share. That's not a good situation.
I've been vocal about this even on this show and in private. I don't think it matters what Verra does in their final decision about carbon tokens on this philosophical sense that let's say they do the quote unquote right thing by us. The problem still exists that we need to make that if they didn't do the right thing, we'd be in trouble. You never want to be in that position. Here's my very strange analogy, Rez.
Oh no.
It's very strange. If you have a significant other that wants to cheat on you, let's say, whether or not they do it is immaterial. It's the fact that they wanted to in the first place, which is the problem, right? So if you prevent an unfaithful significant other from being unfaithful to you, you didn't actually solve the problem. You just avoided the symptom for now, right? So we, and maybe this is my last thing is, because this is such an enormous task and it is going to take time, there's two things I would say to everybody watching this and everybody who wants to take part in this is be cooperative with people and with good actors in the space. Don't be cooperative. Like, you don't have to support everybody because some people are not honest, right? Like, do your best judgment to figure out who's a good faith actor. But the good faith actors, support them, talk to them, help them in a meaningful way if you can. And the other thing is we got to be patient, right? Don't get discouraged because I think you're right. I don't think this is going to be an easy or a quick fix. But we'll see the mettle of this space and how sincere people are about changing things. It's not gonna, dude. Who said it was gonna be easy?
Oh no, yeah. It's like you can have quick wins, but it's the long wins that matter ultimately. And I would like to emphasize at the tail end of this that fundamentally Verra has done a lot of good things for the space. Okay. If Verra didn't exist, we might be in a scenario where the carbon markets are still completely irrelevant. There's a lot of props that needs to be given for where we are right now, and it's not obvious if we'd be here without any of the big registries like CDM, like Gold Standard, like Verra. It's just obviously everything could always be done better, and competitive markets generally make people do their best of being better because there are alternatives, and if you don't see that things are getting better, you can leave. If there is no such option on the table, there is less incentives to be better.
Love it. Couldn't agree more. And Rez, thank you for saying that. We have been shitting on Verra, to be perfectly honest, for a while, but I do think this episode has illustrated that their task is incredibly difficult. Like the intent of this was not to say that Verra has been bad, but actually that they are meeting or providing a solution to a problem that is very hard. They've succeeded better than anybody. So shit on them all you want until you've provided a better solution. They're still the top dog.
Exactly. It's
Right?
like do better, you know.
Exactly. All right. This was the most erudite episode. I'm glad we did this. I was gonna we were talking about maybe doing macro news. Let's just keep it this way because I think this is a really cool self-contained kind of explainer. I do have to. You know what? I'm not even gonna ask you how much you're bench pressing. That's how much seriousness I think this episode deserves. So I'm not even going to ask you how much you bench press because I'm sure you're going to post it on your Twitter after we conclude. So keep an eye on that. Also, make sure to write whitelist in the description of the video so you can get whitelisted for Rez Coin.
The Rez Coin, we did away with additionality, permanence, and leakage. It's like the best coin ever. Please, for the love of God, don't use it as carbon offsets. But you know, if you want to,
can we say Rez Coin and the slogan is additionality, leakage, and permanence is bullshit?
Oh no!
All right, we'll catch you all on the next one. Remember to ape responsibly. Peace, dudes and dudettes.